running back start sits for week 15. It's playoff time. Here are some guys on the bubble we need to talk about. The first one, and this is contingent on some injuries, but Jeff Wilson against the Dallas Cowboys. They're 26th against the run. Assuming no Raheem Mostert, where are you valuing Jeff Wilson this week in an incredible matchup?
Yeah, Steph, I know we were talking about him earlier this week because you might have to roll him out in our semifinal matchup, in the league that you just beat me in. And I was kind of fading Jeff Wilson, but the more I've thought about it, the more I've looked into it. If Raheem Mostert is out, I'm willing to start Jeff Wilson against the Cowboys. Now, again, it depends on what your options are. Like, I know you've got Miles Sanders, you've got J.K. Dobbins, you've got, David Johnson. So over those guys, I think I'd still keep Jeff Wilson on the bench. I would take those options over Wilson, especially Miles Sanders and J.K. Dobbins this week. But if you're one of these teams in a pinch, if you had Rojo and, he fractures his pinky and is on the COVID list, or you are still waiting on McCaffrey to come back, or, any of these running back situations, James Conner, any of these volatile situations, I think Jeff Wilson can be plugged in as your RB2, and he could have a really good week. I mean, you look back at the upside as well. I know we were talking so much about upside. Jeff Wilson against the Patriots this season, 112 yards, 3 touchdowns on the ground. We know San Francisco loves to run the ball. We know they're going to, with now Deebo Samuel banged up again and Nick Mullins in at quarterback. So I think Jeff Wilson is a start. I think he is a top 24 play this week. It just depends on what other kind of options you have. I think against Dallas, he could have a really good game. And that formula of no Mostert, McKinnon's not involved anymore. Coleman is irrelevant anyway, but he's banged up. So I think Jeff Wilson is a good play this week.
I have him as a high-end RP2, assuming Mostert's out. And Mostert did miss practice on Wednesday when we're recording. So I think I'm going to be firing up Jeff Wilson in a lot of spots. Who knew at the start of the season that this guy would be winning people playoff matchups? Let's talk about J.D. Mckissic, who's in another great matchup. No Antonio Gibson, and he's playing the Seattle Seahawks. They're 21st against the running back position. Their defense has been stepping it up a little bit lately. I think that's just some regression that we would expect with how bad their defense was to start the year. But for J.D. Mckissic, is he kind of what he has been, which is this, high value in PPR league type of running back that you can plug in where you need to?
Yeah, 100%. If you need 10 to 15 points out of your RB2 or flex spot in a PPR league, you go J.D. Mckissic. If he gets into the end zone, you get above 20 because, with Antonio Gibson out, he's super valuable in PPR. I mean, last week was like a worst-case scenario. The offense was terrible. They weren't moving the ball at all against San Francisco. Alex Smith goes out. Dwayne Haskins comes in. Somehow J.D. Mckissic still ends up with over 10 PPR fantasy points. So the floor is super high with Antonio Gibson out of the lineup. And I think, if you need a safe floor play, J.D. Mckissic is a great option against Seattle, especially in a game where I do expect Washington to be trailing. Last week was even more of a bad game script for J.D. Mckissic because they were winning that game against San Francisco, making plays with their defense. Against Seattle, I think we all expect him to trail. I think we could see 10 targets coming McKissic's way, especially if Alex Smith is the quarterback. So he's a super safe floor play with some upside if he gets into the end zone as well.
The only other thing about J.D. Mckissic is that, he's not one of these bell cow backs. They're not going to use him in all facets of the game. He's not going to get 100% snap share under any scenario, nowhere close to it. I mean, his high over the last 2 weeks is 73%, which is solid. You'll take that from a lot of running backs. But for a guy with J.D. McKissic's skill set, doesn't get you super excited. He's pretty much what he has been all season, sitting at the RB25. So definitely a spot start plug-in type of name there, desperation flex. Let's talk about Melvin Gordon, who's been coming on lately when the Broncos offense has had Drew Lock back in the lineup. Kind of a pretty solid outing. And he has Buffalo this week. They're middle of the pack. They're 16th against the running back position. Are you willing to roll Melgo out there? A guy who's been super volatile, has burned a lot of people. In a fantasy playoff winner-go-home situation, is it Melgo or no?
I would try to avoid Melvin Gordon this week. I mean, he is banged up. It looks like he's going to be good to go for Saturday, but he has been a little bit banged up with an injury. I mean, only 46% of snaps last week, only 52% the week before. He has been a little bit hot lately, back-to-back double-digit performances, super volatile on the season. In a matchup against Buffalo, a team that, you can move the ball on, I think he has a chance to get in the end zone, but The guys we've already talked about, Jeff Wilson, J.D. Mckissic, I think I'd take both of them over Melvin Gordon this week. I think Melvin Gordon is an RB2 this week. I think he's a low-end RB2, somewhere in that 22 to 24 range. You're kind of hoping for some receiving work, some volume, and just praying he gets in the end zone because that's really going to be the thing that makes his day. So I'm willing to start Gordon, but again, I think there's just so many other good options you could pivot to, especially with where the season is. You look at some of the options that are out there, and a lot of them have come on as of late that you could have gotten on the waiver wire. I mean, Cam Akers, who we've talked about a ton, Jeff Wilson, who you could have picked up this week, J.D. Mckissic, who was a hot waiver wire ad a couple weeks ago. I think those are the kind of guys I'd be willing to play over Gordon because they have higher floors to me, and I think similar upside. So that's kind of my take on Gordon, willing to start him, but trying to pivot if I can.
Yeah, it sucks because with Phillip Lindsay being out earlier in the year with injury, Melvin Gordon's value was a little bit inflated, and it took a while for us to kind of shake off some of that perception. And then the pendulum swung all the way the other way where he was putting up, 3 fantasy points on some of these weeks. I have him as a low-end RB2, a guy that you can plug in just for a safe, 10-plus fantasy points. Don't expect, 25-plus out of him. But the matchup is good enough, and he's getting the high-value touches. Last guy to talk about, kind of cut from the same cloth as a Melvin Gordon, fantasy-wise these days, it's David Johnson, who is coming back from COVID, the COVID IR list after dealing with concussion and some other issues. Been a whole number of issues for DJ so far this year. I'm a huge fan of the guy, but he's against the Indianapolis Colts. They're 12th against the running back position. I have him as a high-end RB3 this week. Not a guy that I'm in love with starting, but certainly one that, if you were relying on a lot of the other options, these COVID or injury scenarios where you got to plug a guy in, I'm willing to plug David Johnson in. I'm just not expecting a boom game against a tough Colts run defense.
Yeah, just to kind of put it into perspective, I mean, David Johnson has played 9 games this season. His highest fantasy point outing in full PPR was 19 fantasy points. So the upside hasn't quite been there. The highest
week 1, right?
Yeah, week 1 in that game against Kansas City. The most fantasy points he has put up in a game where he hasn't scored a touchdown is 12. So, I mean, the upside is very, very low. You're hoping he gets into the end zone. If he doesn't score, you're probably looking at 6 to 12 fantasy points. If he does, you're looking at 10 to 18. And against a tough Colts defense, I'm not expecting much. He's coming back off of a variety of issues. I mean, the COVID list, I don't think he had COVID from what I've seen, but coming off the concussion. So, I'm just not really interested this week. I mean, we saw him against Indy a couple weeks ago, 10 fantasy points. That was I believe the first game back off of the concussion, and he just didn't look great, didn't have a lot of, juice or spark in his game. So in another matchup where they're actually in Indy this time, I'm not expecting much more from David Johnson in this matchup. So I'm trying to sit him if I can.
Yeah, there's definitely been a cap on his value this year. Earlier in the season, it was kind of fun when I had a roster where I was loaded pretty much at every other position and could just kind of plug in DJ there as a high floor RB2, but that's certainly not what you want at this point. I think that floor is lower than it's ever been in games where he's been active and healthy.